welcome tonight. We've just heard from Erica that she will be speaking next week, and we are instead going to have Chris Knight. I should say, come close, Chris, come into shot. Chris is, don't mind me saying how old you are, 82. He has never missed a lecture in his life. No lecture to students, nor a lecture at RAG for over 40 years.
Wow.
He's here.
I'm still alive. Amazing.
Better than that. Now, this story he's going to be engaging us with is a very notable Amazonian myth that he's wrestled with himself. Many moons, many years, decades, or back there. But it suddenly occurred to him, he never probably published the text, that when he read Graeber and Wengrow's infamous, wretchedly famous book, Dawn of Everything, he had an answer, or rather Monmanéki, the Hunter Monmanéki and his wives had answers to the key question of their book, which is, how did we get stuff? So I'm going to let Chris tell us about
Yes,
that.
thanks, Camilla. So welcome to Radical Anthropology. Radical, we chose that name because of kind of radishes in a way. Radishes are roots, and we always thought it's very important, really, for doing any kind of study to work out who we are, why we are now, by going to the roots of things. And for us, the roots of things is how did we become human, when did we become human, what was involved in all that. One of the most exciting events, actually, of recent years has been precisely the book that Camilla's been mentioning, David Graeber and David Wengrow, The Dawn of Everything. And probably more than anyone, really, since Frederick Engels, when he wrote The Origin of the Family, Private Property and the State. That was the book which, when I was about 17 or 18, got me going. Engels argued that there was a time when we were all communists, in some sense. He would have acknowledged that you could not use that word, perhaps, but in those days, of course, the word communism was quite widely accepted, that early human society was in some sense sharing, communistic. And only later did we have the rise of private property, the nuclear family, and the state. And Engels, I won't go into this in any great detail, but he was inspired by work by Lewis Henry Morgan, working with the Iroquois Indians. And he noticed that they were communistic in the way they organized their lives, their household, their property, and everything else. And he argued that the future for society, if there was a future, would be a return on a higher level to the equality, liberty, and fraternity of the Iroquois clan. In other words, he argued that history is kind of works in a spiral. It doesn't just move forward and everything's like different. There's a kind of logic to moving away from the way we began, and then coming back to it, but of course on a higher level. So the future communism for Engels would be resembling the communism we began with, but of course on a massively larger, grander scale. So one of the things to understand, I think, about David Graeber is how he dealt with, obviously he was a great friend of ours, and of course, I imagine most of you know, he tragically died during the COVID period. But this is a wonderful book, Debt, the First 5,000 Years. And I remember I was with David, we were great friends, activists together, and he gave me the proofs before it had been published. And when I read it, I was just a bit surprised, because it starts with his view of precisely that topic, communism. And I'll just read this out. Our thinking about communism has been dominated by a myth. And then he makes fun of Engels' story. Once upon a time, humans held all things in common. In the Garden of Eden, during the golden age of Saturn, in Paleolithic hunter-gatherer bands, and then came the fall, as a result of which we are now cursed with divisions of power and private property. The dream was, he tells us, this is David, that someday, with the advance of technology and general prosperity, with social revolution, we would finally be in a position to put things back, to restore common ownership and common management of collective resources. And then he writes, throughout the last 2 centuries, communists and anti-communists argued over how plausible this picture was, and whether it would be a blessing or a nightmare, but they all agreed on the basic framework. Communism was about collective property. Primitive communism did once exist in the distant past, and someday it might return. We might call this mythic communism, or even epic communism, a story we like to tell ourselves. Since the days of the French Revolution, it has inspired millions, but it has also done enormous damage to humanity. It's high time, I think, to brush the entire argument aside. And so David was just saying there was never a time when we were particularly egalitarian, or that women had more power than they do today, or there may have been moments when we were maybe communistic, but on the other hand, because our distant ancestors were so imaginative and creative, they would maybe have communism for a while and then get a bit bored with it, and then say, well, why don't we have a bit of despotism, perhaps a bit of human sacrifice, and then they move into that version of that possibility. And so you'd have kind of, it seems to be a kind of idea that if you've got freedom of choice, you won't be stuck with a thing called communism or egalitarianism. You'll keep switching to and fro between the two. But what is the case, according to his later book, The Dawn of Everything, is that although once in the past we would move between alternative political and social arrangements, something happened in the course of history. And what happened is that we got stuck. And today we're stuck in one form of despotism, the corporate capitalist form we're all aware of today. And it seems that there's no way out. It would be it's as hard to imagine, but it's easier to imagine actually the end of the world than to imagine the end of communism, and of capitalism, sorry. And so the question then is, how did we get stuck? Why did we get stuck? And it's when I've read the solution, the answer to that question, that I really scratched my head and just could hardly believe what I was reading. He talks about Bourbon monarchs and James I and other kings and queens, going back a bit, but basically, obviously, pretty recent history. So he writes, they write, ultimately the house of the Bourbon monarchs, like the palace of an Egyptian pharaoh, Roman emperor, Aztec, Tlatoani, or Sapa Inca, was not merely a structure of domination, but also a structure of care, where a small army of courtiers labored night and day to attend to the king's every physical need and prevent him, as much as was humanly possible, from ever feeling anything but divine. In all these cases, the bonds of violence and care extended downwards as well as upwards. We could do no better than put it in the words made famous by King James I of England in the true law of free monarchies. And this is James I, who's quoted here. As the father, or perhaps I should read it more pompously, as the father of his fatherly duty is to care for the nourishing education and virtuous government of his children, even so is the king bound to care for all his subjects. As the father's wrath and correction of any of his children that offendeth ought to be a fatherly chastisement, seasoned with pity, so long as there is any hope of amendment in them, so ought the king towards any of his lieges that offend in that measure. As the father's chief joy ought to be in procuring his children's welfare, rejoicing in their weal, sorrowing and pitying at their evil, to hazard for their safety, so ought a good prince think of his people. And then they continue. Public torture in 17th century Europe created searing, unforgettable spectacles of pain and suffering in order to convey the message that a system in which husbands could brutalize wives and parents beat children was ultimately a form of love. Violence and care were to be entirely separated, and seen in this light, the distinctive features of Wendat, this Iroquois and other Native American people, seen as like the distinctive features of when the Wendat prisoner torture came into focus. So the idea here is that you love your subjects, you love your victims, and because you love them so much, you need to chastise them, and torture comes into that. And then it seems to us, the authors of this book, it seems to us that this connection, or better, perhaps confusion, between care and domination is utterly critical to the larger question of how we lost the ability freely to recreate ourselves by recreating our relations with one another. It is critical, that is, to understanding how we got stuck and why these days we can hardly envisage our own past or future as anything other than a transition from smaller to larger and larger cages. So it's the way in which kings confuse care with violent coercion, including torture. It's that confusion of the father's duty to care for children involves chastisement, involves punishment. It's that psychological confusion in the heads of kings that
Can you give a page reference, Chris?
Sorry, yes, it's the page reference is page 514 in the Dawn of
Can you
Everything.
give that page 514, Mary?
Yeah. Perhaps worth mentioning before I come to the picture that in 2013, David Graeber's collaborator, David Wengrow, published a book called The Origins of Monsters. And it's a book by an archaeologist describing how it was that these strange creatures which don't really exist, and by monsters, Wengrow meant composite creatures, so like a man with a lion's head, a human female with breasts but the tail of a fish, in other words, a mermaid, maybe a snake with the head of an antelope, maybe humans with antelope heads. Anyway, composite creatures, bits of one creature, perhaps a human, with bits of another creature, usually a predator, sometimes a herbivore. How did these things first emerge in history? And again, when I read the book, I just could hardly believe I was reading this stuff. According to Wengrow, it all happened in the Bronze Age. And the theory is that in the Bronze Age, you began to have state forms of marking property, and different property owners with their lineages would have a stamp, and they'd stamp their property as with say an eagle stamp, and somebody else might have a leopard, and somebody else might have a lion. So you'd have these stamps that you use to mark your property as yours. And David's theory to explain the origin of monsters is that they discovered that they could mix a lion with an eagle, and because the stamps were separate, the components of these monsters could be arranged in different ways, and the bureaucrats running these state societies sometimes needed to do that. And as a result, you had monsters.
So because you could get more variety of stamps by mixing them
Or
up.
because you had the technological ability to mix up an eagle with a lion with a snake, because you had these separate stamps. And so
To go and development of a writing tool with a certain way of printing.
yes, it's a form of printing, that's right. Yeah. So the markings are isolable and discrete and combinatorial, and you can combine one bit with another, and then wow, you're going to start getting monsters.
Instead of drawing something, you're stamping or like.
Yeah.
That's it. That's it. So-
In Victor Turner's descriptions of Ndembu masquerade, Ikishu ceremony, he's also talking about these masks made of one side is the earth, the land, and another side is a lion, and it's kind of combined into
Yeah.
something monstrous. But I mean, that's
The thing is that one of the criticisms I made of the Dawn of Everything was, of course, that it has nothing to do with the Dawn of Everything. It was like, I think it was Camilla who actually invented this phrase. It was the tea time of everything. It was far too late. The whole book about the Dawn of Everything is actually a book about what happened in the Upper Paleolithic, which is far, far too late, nothing like the dawn. So that, but the others, I mean, here when we talk about monsters, I mean, to say that that totemism and all the different cave art and rock art and so on was absolutely full of creatures, evolving into each other, humans turning to animals, animals turning to humans. I mean, to say that it was starting with the Bronze Age, you just think, what planet is this guy on? But he's a very esteemed, archaeologist. And sorry, and he lectures across the road here, so I'm going to get into terrible trouble for saying all this. So, now, I mean, I'm going to come to the myth in a moment, but the myth I'm going to be reading out is one of the key myths of Claude Lévi-Strauss's marvelous and extraordinary, work, Mythology, 4-volume study of all the myths of the North and South America, in which he comes to the conclusion that all of those myths amount at the end, in terms of their underlying syntax, to one myth only. And one of the key myths, and the myths he's most happy about his own analysis of, is called the Hunter Monmanéki and his wives, and it's a Tukuna myth. And from not too far away, just quite recently, we've had this astonishing, I mean, it's called a discovery. I don't quite understand how it can be called a discovery. All kinds of people must have known about it, but this is a piece of rock art which is about a mile long in Colombia, it was when it was first discovered, obviously only about 4 or 5 years ago. The archaeologists didn't quite know what to make of it all, but luckily, just recently, about 4 weeks ago, it's been published in the Journal of Archaeological Anthropology, an analysis of this incredible piece of art, which fortunately is informed by indigenous scholars.
Show the Zoom
So,
people.
okay.
Take the camera a little bit.
Well, yes, can you sort of see
bit
it all?
closer, so
Okay, so I mean, what you can see here is, first of all, it's all in red ochre. Secondly, how many zigzags can you see? I mean, zigzag here, zigzags here, wavy line here, zigzags here. Well, what's a zigzag? It's a mathematical symbol, of course, of.
take it closer up.
Well, I can't
Zoom
get it that
people.
close. All right,
Well,
okay.
a bit
Sorry,
closer.
sorry, everybody. Sorry, everybody.
Can you see the
Can you see the
zigzags
zigzags?
on Zoom properly?
Can you see it, everybody?
Sorry, the visuals aren't very good.
So here we are, doing zigzag, 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 zigzag,
Yeah.
zigzag.
Oh no, you're
Is that clear?
Get on. Did you get the idea?
Now, along with these zigzags in red ochre, we have animals and we have humans. And the critical point is that the indigenous informants, if you like, the people that the archaeologists asked to say, what the hell does all this mean? They said, well, of course, in the distant past, people turned into animals and animals turned into people. It was, no human would just be stuck as being a human. Clearly you turn into an animal, maybe a different animal this time, and then clearly the animals turn into humans. And of course we know, don't we, that all the world's fairy tales are about talking animals, and animals, giving you information, and humans and animals all got language, and we turn into each other. So that you're not even, I mean, it's like, these assumptions are that we're not stuck in any form. So in the dream time, in the dawn of everything, to use the title of the book, sorry, the two Davids wrote, we were moving between constant states. Everything was fluid. And what a very important point is that even death originally was not a permanent state. I've actually got, I think here, yes, this is actually from David Graeber himself in his book on the divine kingship. And David describes a dinka. I mean, it's just moving away from this area. But the astonishing thing is that, well, actually I think it's the first scientific paper I ever published. It was in anthropology and medicine. It was about Australian Aboriginal myths of the origin of death. And all over the world, the origin of death has got something to do with the moon. The moon has got this ability. The moon knows how to die properly. The way to die properly is to die and then come alive again, and die and come alive again. The moon's got that secret. And what happened was that this terrible tragedy happened, which is where we are today. When we're dead, we've moved into the land of the dead, and we can't get back. We're stuck. We're dead, and we stay dead. And I can't think of a bigger tragedy than that. And it was all because of a mistake, because we lost touch with the moon. The moon was trying to tell maybe a hare, maybe some other animal, this is the way to die, folks. And the hare was a stupid animal. It muddled up the message, it got it wrong. And as a result of that, when we die, we stay dead.
It had a grudge against the moon misleading it, and it fought back. It wasn't stupid. It was resistant.
Well, many of the myths say, you silly fool, now when we die, we stay dead because you didn't listen properly to the moon. The common theme is through disconnection from the moon, now that when we die, we stay dead. And Graeber in his book on kingship has another version from the Dinka. And the reason I'm sort of feeling a bit free to float around between different parts of the world, because Levi-Strauss is right. At the deepest syntactical level, all of the world's magical myths and fairy tales amount, and this is absolutely amazing, they amount to one myth only. In other words, spread across the entire planet is a single myth. Doesn't mean the stories don't vary. It's a bit like saying all life on Earth is ever so simple. It's DNA, 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 CGTA. I mean, the letters of the alphabet. That means variety, because you can combine those letters of the alphabet of deoxyribonucleic acid in countless different ways. So Levi-Strauss is not saying everything's the same. He's saying thanks to the structure of world mythology, we have all this variety, but ultimately at the deepest level, is that all the world's myths are variations on a very small number of themes, and one of them is the origin of death. And so David Graeber is writing here about the kingship, about the Dinka version. Originally, the sky lay just above the earth. The two were connected by a rope, so people could clamber up and down at will. Since the living could ascend to the sky for a while before returning to this world, death was merely a temporary state. And I won't go on with the myth, but the story just simply says that, actually, in this case, it was a woman with a hoe. She was lifting the hoe up to pound the grain, and unfortunately, she bumped into the sky. And as a result of that, the sky and the earth separated. And now there's this terrible state where when we die, we're stuck up there and we can't get back. And that's how we got stuck. Okay, here we have clear evidence, if nothing else really, that this idea of moving between different worlds, periodicity, is, I mean, it goes, including movement between animal and human form, and therefore animals being humans, a big sort of composite creatures, part out, all that goes back way, way, way earlier than the Bronze Age. I'm now going to try and do this myth. It's an extraordinary myth. One of the things we have to remember is that when you write the myths down, you lose the humour. And when you hear the stories being told, Jerome Lewis, of course, tells me this, that people are just in stitches of laughter. So please sort of hear the bawdy adult humour, the bawdy laughter involved in all this. But I'm going to try and read out this story in bits. And instead of what I would do if we had lots of time, give you all the myths to ponder over, give a workshop, and then see what you make of it. I think the best thing for me to do would be to read out bits of the myths and then see what you think of them and what we're getting. Just remember that following Levi-Strauss, we're not initially interested in what does it mean. I think Levi-Strauss is absolutely right. I mean, all these myths, they mean whatever you think they mean. Meanings are social, and the meanings you derive from the stories depend on the local culture, the ideology, and all the rest of it. The only really kind of satisfactorily scientific approach to the stories is to not worry too much about meanings, but think about patterns, structures, like mathematical, geometrical patterns, which we can begin to discern. So that's what we're looking for here. So, a hunter called Monmanéki goes through a succession of marriages. First, in a hole in the ground, he passes a frog who turns into an attractive young woman. In the story, he's pissing into this hole, and the frog says, "Oh, what a lovely penis." Having pissed on her and got her pregnant, the hunter takes her home and feeds her on her favourite food, a diet consisting of black beetles. So, I mean, can you see what kind of marriage is this? When the hunter's out in the wild, he pisses in a hole, finds a worm, she turns into a beautiful human, he takes her home. There's two basically contrasting types of marriage among hunter-gatherers and others. Matrilocal, that means, of course, the man has to visit his sweetheart, his bride, and stay there to have sex. If he wants anything else, he has to come back to his sisters. But for sex, he certainly has to stay there. And then, of course, there's patrilocal. You take the woman home with you. This is clearly a version of which type of marriage? Patrilocal, that's right, yes. So back at home, the hunter's mother sees the beetles and exclaims, "Why does my son soil his mouth with such filth?" She throws away the beetles and puts hot peppers in their place. When the frog wife burns her mouth on the peppers, she turns back into a frog and hops off, returning later to steal back her baby from her mother-in-law's arms. Now, what we notice in all of the myths is that in order to distance yourself, you turn into an animal, and when you become intimate with somebody, you turn back into a human. So when humans are intimate with each other, they take that human form, and the way to say "I'm off" is to turn into a wild beast. So that's what she does when she's fed up with it. I mean, and of course, what's going on here is that the woman is now not with her own mother; she's with her mother-in-law, who doesn't get it. The mother-in-law doesn't get that she needs to have black beetles, and she says, "You don't eat. That's not proper food. Have some hot peppers." And of course, it's when the frog turns into a when she burns her lips that she hops off in frog form. But she has to return later to steal back her baby from her mother-in-law's arms. So it's like she's stealing the baby, and that's how the myth puts it. But of course, when you think of that, you think, how can a mother steal a baby? It must be that the mother-in-law has asserted some rights in the woman's baby, so they have to do an act of stealing in order to return to what obviously is her baby. Right, next section. Having seen an Arapaho bird high up in a palm tree, Monmanéki asks her for a drink of palm wine. The bird becomes a pretty girl who offers him the drink. He takes her home, where his mother objects to her feet. And the point is that Arapaho birds, they have lovely feathers, but they have great long toes with really long curved nails. So the mother-in-law thinks, why would he want a woman that's, okay, she's pretty, but what about her feet? So again, offended, she turns back into a bird and leaves. Part 3, next section. The hunter is out hunting when an earthworm, over whom he is defecating, takes a fancy to his penis. So he's shitting on an earthworm. The earthworm says, "Oh, what a lovely penis you've got." And obviously, she knows how to make a man happy. And she turns into an attractive young woman. And Monmanéki takes her home, where she gives birth to a child. The worm girl works in the garden, clipping the roots of weeds just below the surface of the ground. So she's a worm. She knows how to do the weeding. Right as they go, she clip, 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 clip with her lips. And it's a brilliant method of doing the weeding. But of course, the weeds take a bit of a while to wilt and die through that method of doing the weeding. So seeing the weeds still standing and not realizing that they will soon wilt, the mother-in-law accuses her of being idle, and with a sharp-edged shell, cuts off her lips just beneath the surface of the ground. She can no longer speak properly and disappears. I mean, what a shocking image this is. But again, the mother-in-law gets everything wrong. She's actually, the worm is really industrious, hardworking, but she's accused of being lazy. And the consequence of this clipping is that she's silenced. She can't speak properly. She hasn't got any lips. Monmanéki is out hunting again when he notices macaws flying overhead. He shouts to them for some maize beer, and later finds a macaw girl waiting for him. Having sipped her beer, he takes her home. His mother gives her a pile of corn cobs from which to brew more beer. The girl succeeds in making large quantities using one cob alone. On seeing so many unused cobs, her mother-in-law scolds her for being lazy. Angrily, the girl changes back into a macaw and climbs to the roof of the house. So I mentioned that Claude Lévi-Strauss's method is to look for sort of patterns, maybe these sorts of patterns, zigzags. So, probably best if I kind of get some feedback from you. In terms of the kind of wives that Monmanéki obtains and brings back home, can you notice a sort of pretty geometrical pattern? The first wife is a frog in a hole. The second wife is an arapaco bird up in the trees. The third wife is a worm, and the fourth wife is a macaw. What's the geometry?
Zigzagging between the earth and the sky.
Thank you, Christine. High, low, high, low, high, low, high. And there's another thing going on as well, another contradiction, isn't there? And it's like a kind of productivity, work ethos contradiction in the story, because each time the wife is hard-working but mistaken for being lazy by her mother-in-law. Okay, and then in terms of like what Lévi-Strauss would call the alimentary code, in other words, eating stuffs, there's a nice alternation between opposites, because the first husband gives his wife piss, the first wife gives him lovely palm wine, the third wife he shits on, so he's giving her shit. You see what's going on? It's just like we have food, and what's the opposite of food? I would say probably shit. And in terms of drink, what's the opposite of nice palm wine? Well, I would say piss. It's hard to think what Monmanéki is actually giving these wives apart from shit and piss, and a mother-in-law who doesn't understand anything at all about what about the creativity of her daughter-in-law. So we get these contradictions, and as things are going up and down between one world and another. So we're beginning to see a kind of structure, and we kind of know in a way in advance where everything's going to end, because we know that all of these stories are kind of versions of the origin of death. We're going to get zigzag, 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 and then the rope is cut. So think of the Tower of Babel. Humans are trying to reach heaven, and God got cross, didn't he? And stay down there, you lot. So the tower connecting heaven and earth starts to crumble, and of course, because of all the different languages, it all falls to the ground. But there's so many stories which end, Jack and the Beanstalk, the English Cornish story, of course, is about a beanstalk. You go up and down, up and down, up and down between this one and the other, and then the beanstalk's cut, and then you have this situation. The sky is the sky, the earth's the earth, death is death, life is life. You get a separation, and the zigzagging has stopped. So there used to be a periodicity, a cyclicity of movement, and then earth and sky, life and death, and animal and human, all these features, they separate. And that is what getting stuck is all about. You get stuck in death, you get stuck as an animal, you get stuck as a human, and so on. But it's to do with the movement between the two is connected with kinship and marriage, and where a woman lives, where a man lives, which in-law you're with, and these fundamental categories of kinship. So we've got to the macaw, who's making large quantities of beer using just one cob. It's obviously some form of magic she's got. And I'll repeat this last bit. On seeing so many unused cobs, her mother-in-law scolds her for being lazy. Angrily, and it always happens, as you move away, you turn into an animal. Angrily, the girl changes back into a macaw and climbs to the roof of the house. Before flying away, however, she cries to her husband, if he loves her, he should follow her. She instructs him to look for a laurel whose splinters, when the trunk is axed, splash into the water to become fish. When the log has been hollowed out, he should get into the canoe which he has made and follow her down the river. So just to repeat that, there's a certain kind of laurel, you chop it, you make splinters, the splinters fall into the water, and they turn into fish. And you keep chopping this tree until you've got your canoe, and then you get inside the canoe, whose splinters have produced all these fish, and you go after the poor girl down the river. So, Monmanéki is actually keen on this wife. He searches desperately until he finds that laurel. Each day when he returns home from working on his canoe, Monmanéki brings so many fish that his lazy brother-in-law decides to spy on him to discover his secret. But this ruins the magic. Of course, when somebody else is looking at your secret, it's not a secret anymore. The magic disappears, it becomes too public. So the splinters stop turning into fish. Guessing that his brother-in-law must be nearby, Monmanéki asks him for help with his canoe. They complete it, launch it into the river. While his brother-in-law stands in the shallows, Monmanéki tips the canoe over him. His victim spends the night underneath in the dark, singing and crying. I think we'll probably have to wait a bit before working out what on earth's going on here with splinters falling into the river and turning into fish. But Lévi-Strauss does say that he's successfully decoded the motif of this brother-in-law, the one who breaks the spell by spying on his own brother-in-law. Why is it that he's under a canoe making a loud noise? Lévi-Strauss says the two brothers, whenever you get these conflicts between brothers, they're always the sun and the moon. You've got a canoe, the moon is at the back doing the steering, the sun's in the front. And here, Monmanéki is so upset with his brother-in-law that he tips the canoe over, and that's an eclipse. You're in the dark, making a noise. And I mean, Lévi-Strauss gets a lot of these things beautifully right, very, very compelling, very, very convincing. Next day, the two men, but don't let me forget the little chips of wood turning into fish. Pretty important, and initially completely baffling, of course. And I suppose I should just stress, this is the marvelous thing about Lévi-Strauss. Whatever people complain about him, the point is, what he says is that if you can't understand something in a myth, it's your problem. Every detail counts. Every little tiniest detail of a myth, which has been passed down the generations, is there for a reason. Think about it. Think about it. Think about it. Put yourself in the shoes of the storyteller. Know something about their culture. And if you think, oh, this looks like an absurdity, let me just say all of these stories are kind of long sequences of absurdity piled upon absurdity upon absurdity. But absurdities are just metaphors. They're things that aren't literally true, but they're deeply true in a more fundamental sense. Any myth is an extraordinarily creative, enormously extended metaphor, and it is pretty important to understand these stories. But you can only do it in terms of each other. In other words, Lévi-Strauss says just one story on its own will be a little bit of a challenge to understand. But the more versions, the more variations on these themes you see, the more convincing it all becomes. And I think at the end of the day, Lévi-Strauss's conclusion that we have one single myth embracing the entire planet is very convincing, although there are problems with some of its starting points. Anyway, next day, the two men drift downstream, Monmanéki at the stern and his brother-in-law seated at the prow. So Monmanéki's doing the steering and his brother-in-law is doing sort of paddling. As they approach the macaw girl's village, the people come out to greet them. The girl hides behind the crowd. Turning into a monan bird, we'll hopefully come back to the monan bird later on, Monmanéki's brother-in-law perches on his sister's shoulder. So don't forget, Monmanéki's following his macaw wife, and on the landing as the canoe approaches is his wife's brother, Monmanéki's brother-in-law. The canoe drifts away before tipping up perpendicularly. So it drifts along like that. So we have moon here, sun here, drifting on this way, and then it turns up and goes vertical. So many of these stories imply a kind of horizontal plane of action, followed by a vertical plane, and this story is no exception. And it's not too difficult to see that the horizontal plane has got something to do with a sort of remnant of an egalitarian arrangement. And when everything gets vertical, all we have these top-down relationships between people. In other words, hierarchical relationships. There's always something of that going on. The canoe drifts away before tipping up perpendicularly, whereupon Monmanéki turns into an Aika bird and perches on the macaw girl's other shoulder. As the empty canoe drifts toward a lake, it turns into the aquatic rainbow snake, responsible for the periodic spawning of fish. The canoe turns into the snake, which is the fertility of the fish. So we have this. So you can begin to connect those two things. The wood of the canoe is the fertility of the fish, and the splinters of the canoe is the abundance of fish. You're beginning to see that parts of the story are kind of connecting up. Finally, nearly at the end now, Monmanéki marries a girl belonging to the same people as himself. So most marriages, of course, are exogamous. You have to marry a stranger, otherwise it's incest. And of course, I've already explained that when people are distant from you, they are animals. So of course, you have to marry an animal. Otherwise, if you marry a human, it's bound to be incest, because the category of human means your immediate neighbours. Everyone's an animal, but you've got to marry these animals. And when you do marry an animal, in becoming intimate with you, they resume their or assume their human form. But now he's marries a girl belonging to the same people as himself. Her fishing technique is to divide herself at the waist, leaving her lower body on the riverbank. The upper part enters the water and emerges carrying large quantities of fish. This upper part then crawls on its hands to the bank, where it lowers itself onto the bottom portion, from which the spinal cord protrudes like a finger. I kind of ask you to visualize this. This poor woman, instead of having to move to and fro, we now have a kind of vertical plane where she splits apart. It's vertical, and she has this amazing method. She splits herself in two, and the top part, which must be all bloody, goes into the water, and somehow all that magically produces fish. She comes out of the water, and meanwhile she's left her lower part on the bank, and because she's been split in part, her lower part has a spinal cord sticking up, and the top part has to sort of settle itself down and fit itself together again. So you're sort of seeing the two halves of the same flesh. We know that Monmanéki has married the same flesh in a sort of sense, because he's married his own people. Okay, and now we're expecting, aren't we, the usual problem. The problem with patriarchal marriage for a woman is that she has a mother-in-law, and it's not her own mother, it's her husband's mother, who's bound to get everything wrong. And so it happens. One day, Monmanéki's mother discovers her daughter-in-law's lower part on the riverbank, and, not understanding its purpose, pulls off a protruding spinal cord, preventing the divided woman from fitting the two parts of herself together. Shit. Oh, wow. Night falls, and Monmanéki goes out in search of his missing wife. As he passes under a branch, the upper part of her springs onto his shoulders and refuses to let go. Obliged to carry her on his shoulders, Monmanéki grows thin as she snatches everything he tries to eat from his mouth, covering his back with her shit. So all he was doing was giving shit or piss to these women, and now he's getting a taste of his own medicine. One feels. Eventually, this is the last part of it, Monmanéki frees himself by scratching the clinging woman's face with the jaw of a piranha fish. She is so frightened that she lets go long enough for him to dive into the water and swim away. While her lower half remains on the ground, her upper portion perches on one of the posts of Monmanéki's fish weir. Sprouting feathers, she turns into a parrot and flies away, chattering to herself as she goes. So can you see the pattern here? It's like drawing it like this, and finally as the skies separate, the top part of the woman separates from the bottom part, and the top part flies away, making sort of meaningless sounds. There's in her parrot form. So,
the fish
okay. I mean, how long have we got now? Yeah, I've nearly finished. Okay, so
10 minutes.
okay, 10 minutes. Okay. So I mean, all right. So so we have the near far pendulum, the animal human pendulum, the piss versus lovely wine pendulum. We have the nice food versus ship pendulum. All these things, and then of course we have the work ethic. We have the hard-working woman who's always misunderstood as lazy. I think perhaps it'd be best if I just tell you what I think about all this to start with, and then sort of almost like give you my answer, so I quit you, we're not all in the dark so much. What's absolutely clear is the misview that a woman is a periodic creature. She has a cycle. She can be ovulating or menstruating. And when she's menstruating, she shouldn't be with her husband, she should be with her kin, her own flesh. If patriarchal marriage obliges a woman permanently to stay with her husband and his mother, can you see what's going on? That poor woman will be always in the wrong place at the wrong time and completely misunderstood. Because when you're menstruating, you should be in seclusion with your own blood. You should have a special diet. It's coded in the story as black beetles eaten by a frog, But I mean, the point is that if you're with your mother-in-law, the mother-in-law expects people to be, in a marital relationship. So, what on earth is she eating those black, black beetles for? So it's like the mother-in-law kind of never gets that's the condition that the woman's in. She shouldn't really be there. She should be somewhere else. She should be with her own blood, her own flesh, her own kin, eating her own special diet during that period of seclusion, which in all the stories is coded as a kind of temporary death. Women go into seclusion, they're visited by the moon gives them that blood, they're dead as wives for a period because they're not having sex with their husband. Of course, they're coming alive as daughters and sisters and mothers because they're coming alive as blood relatives. But if you're forced to be in the wrong place at the wrong time because the patriarchal marriage has made the marital tie a permanent bond, instead of marriage being a periodic thing, you're married, you're unmarried, you're married, you're unmarried in a wavy line movement. To be stuck in permanent marriage is to be really stuck. And as a woman, you're going to get pulled apart. You're going to be always misunderstood. And even your hard work, the magic you can use through your body to do all sorts of magical things, getting work done, even that's going to be misunderstood. So, I mean, I'm going to have to stop fairly soon. But of course, we have the alternations between the extremes, shit and food and so on. And these alternations between polar extremes, I'm going to sort of read out a little bit here, my paper on this, are accompanied finally by a contrast between feminine beauty and ugliness. You'll find in all the world's fairy tales, there's always a category of ugliness. Ugliness just means you're supposed to be a wife or expected to be a wife, but you're on your period. So, and it's as clear as day that that's what's going on. So the frog wife is beautiful when human, but spoils the effect with her ugly eating habits. The alpaca wife is beautiful, but she has ugly feet. The worm wife is beautiful at first, but then, of course, she's disfigured. She hasn't even got any lips. And then the macaw wife's appearance is not touched on, but her disappearance is. She hides behind the crowd on the landing stage as Monmanéki arrives in his canoe. It is Lévi-Strauss who points out that all of his myths, right through the whole 4 volumes, concern the comings and goings of celestial beings, sun and moon. And as I said, he sees the eclipse and both the macaw girl's disappearance. She disappears behind the crowd, and her brother's overnight imprisonment in an upturned canoe as a form of an eclipse. I'm going to do. Yes, I mean, we know that one of the stories is about this. She hides behind. She's hiding behind, and then we have one bird settling on one shoulder and another bird settling on the other shoulder. So what's happening is the poor woman is now, instead of being able to choose between husband and brother, the story is so clever. Both husband and brother attach themselves to her at the same time. It's a complete disaster. You want to be able to move away from your brother to be with your husband. You want to be able to escape from your husband to be with your brother. To have a marriage where your partner is both husband and brother, my God, that's just such an imprisonment. And we know that of the two birds who settle on the macaw wife's shoulders, one, which is a dark plumaged species, this was discovered by Claude Lévi-Strauss, was born from leaves used by an incestuous brother to wipe his face after his sister had smeared it with black juniper juice. And to anyone familiar with the story of how the moon got its spots, what we know is that dark fluid would inevitably be menstrual blood. I mean, the stories about Lévi-Strauss says, and I'm sure he's right about this, supposing you had to choose one myth from the Americas, which is the starting point. He says he knows it's kind of a little bit fictional to say they all came out of one myth, but he said the myth which never changes across North and South America is, look at the moon when it's full, look at those blotches. How did they get there? And the story is always pretty much the same. And it's because a woman was in her menstrual hut and she was visited by a lover at night. And she thought, who on earth is this? She can't see his face, it's all dark. So what she does, she takes some of her blood and she smears his face with it. And it's only in the morning she looks at all the people around and only one of them has got his face smeared with blood. Fuck, it's my brother. Okay, so she accuses him. Everyone chases after the brother. He runs away. He jumps up, he escapes by getting to the sky, and you can see him there. He's still got those spots on his face. And it's what Lévi-Strauss says is that's a story which can't change very much because there really is a moon up there, and it really has got spots, and you have to have some kind of convincing explanation as to how they got there, and the explanation is going to be something to do with human kinship and marriage and spots. Yeah, really. Now, okay. Now, the myth steadily builds up a picture of mounting contradictions as the hero's wives swing between opposite states, high and low, near and far, beauty and ugliness, hard work and laziness. Each quickly finds herself in the wrong place at the wrong time, faced with a mother-in-law who gets everything wrong. And the story describes what happens when a married woman is stopped from returning home, echoing a theme that is in so many of the myths, the Wives of the Sun and the Moon are published in the DRI. It's as soon as a woman's prevented from being periodic, then she will suffer from that because there's something about the periodicity. It's like suddenly she's in a man-made world, a world made for and by persons who don't have periods, namely males, and it's not a good situation to be in. Yes, okay, so Camilla just reminded me I've got to do this last bit. So anyway, across Amazonia, this is Luisa Beloende's work in particular. She was at UEL, wonderful ethnographer. I'll just say a little story about her. She came back from doing her field work, and she said that as she was in the field, the only thing that the people there were really concerned about was her. And they were, are you menstruating? I mean, don't go near the water, don't do this, or. And when she came back to LSE and told her supervisor about it, they said, oh, don't matter what, that's trivial stuff. A PhD is supposed to deal with theory. There's no theory of menstruation. It's just your personal experience. And so she had to extract any reference to menstruation from her PhD. And she spent all the last, 30, 40 years sort of taking revenge on the LSE by making absolutely clear what's going on here. Anyway, across Amazonia, she says, women are especially qualified to fish because they menstruate. So we need to understand that they use fish poison. It's called timbo. And a popular method is to cut lengths of creeper into manageable portions and splash them about in the water where the sap dissolves and changes the surface tension, suffocating the fish. Producing timber might therefore involve chopping at lengths of creeper. It may not seem clear why the splinters should turn into fish, but of course an indigenous audience would be better informed and would get the metaphor. Should a man travelling in the forest hear the sound chop, 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 sounds of somebody chopping wood, as a man, you'd know, right, I've got to keep away. Because what a woman does when her daughter is menstruating, she makes these chopping sounds to warn people not to come near, because no man must come near a woman when she's in her period. So should a man travelling in the forest hear the sound of wood being chopped, he would know that he should keep well away. This is because, and this is a quote from Lévi-Strauss, among the Ticuna, as soon as a girl detects signs of her first period, she goes off to hide in a nearby bush and replies to her mother's calls by striking two pieces of dry wood together. So the sound, I mean, I'll collapse the argument here, I suppose. The sound of chopping wood indicates fish poison. Fish poison means lots of fish, and so the myth telescopes it and says the splinters of wood go into the water and turn into fish. And it's just a beautifully clever metaphor. And I could read out lots and lots of stuff, which all sorts of ethnographers have pointed out that timbo. One of the things is that when they're making this timbo, the best possible thing is to splash the water over girls who are going through their first menstruation rituals, so that the timber, the fish poison, actually mixes with real menstrual blood. Wow, that really is going to be good fishing.
Fish poison is a substance put in the water to kill a bunch of fish at once and gather them up?
Yeah. You splash the leaves in the water, you make it like a foam, and all the fish suffocate, and you just get a huge abundance of fish, and it's women's job, and it's like a magical thing, because it's magically associated with the menstrual flow. But we'll notice in all of those episodes of women, the hard-working woman is always using some form of magic to get things done, to turn corn cobs into beer, and so it's the magic which the mother-in-law doesn't get, and because she doesn't realise that there's something magical going on, she interprets it as laziness. Okay, I think I can sort of stop, but I mean, what I'm saying is that, okay, what happens at the end, of course, is that the two halves of the woman just split apart. I don't know what about you, but when you think about what a woman's supposed to do, and of course it carries on, doesn't it, all through life. It's that the demands on women to be in this place and that place all simultaneously. It's just like eventually the tension's too great, and she just literally splits apart. One pit going up towards the sky, and the others down on earth. Now, I'm just going to really quickly end. I mean, it's a lovely myth to sort of dream and live with for many nights, because it's actually more educational, in my view, than all the theories I've ever read about how women got depressed. It's a beautiful indigenous understanding there, but what's particularly clear is it explains how, when, why we got stuck. It's when women's periodicity was no longer respected, and marriage, instead of being a periodic relationship, became a permanent bond. That's a far more satisfactory explanation than the idea that it was some king's psychological hang-ups mixing up, love with coercive control that you find in The Dawn of Everything. Okay, thank you.
Questions in the room, and I'll try.